All right, we're back. Tender is the Night, F. Scott Fitzgerald. Historical setting is the Jazz Age, or the final years of the Jazz Age. The 1920s, the Roaring Twenties, were noted. The 1920s were noted for their extravagance and recklessness. That's a word I'm going to use quite a few times in this lecture. I hope you don't get sick of it. Extravagance. The Jazz Age ended with the Great Depression. This novel traces extravagance to destruction. That's really the line of this text. From extravagance to destruction. The age was noted for obsession with youth, an era defined by its attempt to dispose of the social code and replace it with something more fresh and vibrant. American youth became symbolic of the post-war revelry. Let's take a look here. I'll be right back. Look at the opening of the novel here. And right at the gates, we really have the theme introduced. Yeah, here we go. First page, first paragraph. On the pleasant shore of the French Riviera, about halfway between Marseille and the Italian borders, stands a large, proud, rose-colored hotel. Deferential palms cool its flushed facade, and before it stretches a short, dazzling beach. Lately, it has become a summer resort of notable and fashionable people. A decade ago, it was almost deserted after its English clientele went north in April. Now, many bungalows cluster near it. But when this story begins, only the cupolas of a dozen old villas rotted like water lilies among the massed pines between Goss's Hotel des Etrangers and Cahn's, 5 miles away. The hotel and its bright tan prayer rug of a beach were one. In the early morning, the distant image of Cahn's, the pink and cream of old fortifications, the purple Alp that bounded Italy, were cast across the water and lay quavering in the ripples and rings sent up by sea plants through the clear shallows. Before 8, a man came down to the beach in a blue bathrobe, and with much preliminary application to his person of the chilly water, and much grunting and loud breathing, floundered a minute in the sea. When he had gone, beach and bay were quiet for an hour. Merchantmen crawled westward on the horizon. Busboys shouted in the hotel court. The dew dried upon the pines. In another hour, the horns of motors began to blow down from the winding road along the low range of the Moors, which separates the littoral from the true provincial France. Some interesting themes right away. Youth and decay. I mentioned that before with the 1920s, but here again we have the idea of youth and decay. This area was what had been previously rotting and deserted, and now it was brand new and vibrant. There was a new vibrancy about it. A certain sense of prominence and depravity. There's a difference between those who have and those who have not. People who have are held in a place of prominence. Those who have not, disregarded. Now, there's a sense of a fall from greatness that we'll see in this text as well. Another idea here we see is the idea of worship and reality, or truth versus reality. What is true and what is real? And these things are often mixed up in this text, and so you want to keep a keen eye. A lot of that is communicated through rumor. Some is communicated through customs, trends, stereotypes. But what is the truth? And where do you see the truth communicated? Fitzgerald is pretty sly, and so you'll have to watch closely for characters who believe a certain thing about life and reality. The other side's not communicated, and yet that's the obvious missing link. And so being able to see what's being communicated, but what's missing? And am I supposed to interpret these ideas and concepts? Am I supposed to interpret these values from the characters as ironic? And if that's the case, then the values held by them are not worth holding, right? They're supposed to be seen as ridiculous or corrupted, or embracing something that lacks truth and is the opposite of reality, if you will. In this text, even here right away, we see class struggle, a struggle between classes, the haves and the have-nots. Let's jump over to page 19. But Dick Diver, he was all complete there. Silently, she admired him. His complexion was reddish and weather-burned. So was his short hair. A light growth of it rolled down his arms and hands. His eyes were of a bright, hard blue. His nose was somewhat pointed, and there was never any doubt at whom he was looking or talking. And this is a flattering attention. For who looks at us? Glances fall upon us, curious or disinterested, nothing more. His voice, with some faint Irish melody running through it, wooed the world. Yet she felt the layer of hardness in him, of self-control and of self-discipline, her own virtues. Oh, she chose him. And Nicole, his wife, right, lifting her head, saw her choose him. Heard the little sigh at the fact that he was already possessed. Now, this is Rosemary, right? Or Rosemary. Three major conflicts, character conflicts, are established right in the beginning of this text. First one, Dick Diver and Rosemary. There's a conflict here. Is this relationship, is this flirtation sustainable? What's going on between these two? This forbidden love, this forbidden affair. So a tension between older Dick Diver and younger Rosemary. Or Rosemary. I'm going to mess that up each time. Rosemary. Second one, Dick and Nicole. So obviously, Dick, you know what's interesting is I read an entire article about Nicole being described in this way, being described as hot and lovely and pitiful, and in that order, which is a very interesting description of Nicole as being hot and lovely and pitiful. And how do those three things fit? So obviously, if Dick Diver is thinking about an affair or is tempted by an affair with Rosemary, we're going to have an immediate tension established between Nicole and Dick Diver, although that relationship is very complex and it will grow more complex as you read through the text. Or as you work your way through the text, it becomes more and more complicated. And so that tension is not just based on Dick's infatuation with, or Rosemary's infatuation with Dick Diver. The Dick and Nicole tension is unique all its own, and it really is very central to the text. Rosemary adds to some of the complexities. Dick's infatuation with Rosemary is just a byproduct of something deeper and more complicated at the heart of the tension between Dick and Nicole. It's a very complicated relationship. And then the third one, obviously, is Nicole and Rosemary, right? So we have this triangle established right away. So who is Dick Diver? I think we have an interesting comment about this on page 27. It says, he went back into the house, and Nicole saw that one of his most characteristic moods was upon him, the excitement that swept everybody into it, and was inevitably followed by his own form of melancholy, which he never displayed, but at which she guessed. This excitement about things reached an intensity out of proportion to their importance, generating a really extraordinary virtuosity with people. Save among a few of the tough-minded and perennially suspicious, he had the power of arousing a fascinated and uncritical love. The reaction came when he realized the waste and extravagance involved. He sometimes looked back with awe at the carnivals of affection he had given, as a general might gaze upon a massacre he had ordered to satisfy an impersonal bloodlust. That is an incredible character description. I just had to pause and just, my hat's off to Fitzgerald. Incredible, right? So what do we have revealed here about Dick Diver? And it was similar, I would say, back on page, was it 19 we were just at? When it says, this is a flattering attention for who looks at us. Interesting, kind of the narrator speaks to the reader there in an interesting way, kind of breaks that wall. But Dick Diver, he understands people in a way by looking at them, by looking them square in the face, really captivating them. Right away we see him as a man who understands the human mind, perhaps, so much so, or in such a way that he can manipulate. And that is just what he seeks to do, is manipulate. And yet here we see a more complicated reaction, right? Nicole sees a melancholy come upon him after he has been kind of doing his deal among the people. Hey, how you doing? You know, just a schmoozer. But more than that, there's more of a depth here to his schmoozing. That's this feeling I get, right? Because it's working. He's not just an idiot who's like I thinks he's all that. No, people buy into it. I mean, they're really into him, and he has an incredible power over people because of his, I don't know, his way, I suppose, is what the text seems to say, right? Fitzgerald describes, or the narrator describes Dick Diver as a general who would order the massacre of an entire people, right? As a general might gaze upon a massacre he had ordered to satisfy an impersonal bloodlust. Dick Diver's manipulation of people is being equated to or compared with a general who orders a massacre. So what is the violence that Dick Diver is dipping into? What is violent, and why would this connection to a general ordering a massacre, why would that be a good connection with Dick Diver? That's a good question to ask. I think Fitzgerald sets this up very interestingly, because Dick Diver is one who controls, one who manipulates, and yet after he is manipulated, after he has, as it says here, when he realizes later the waste and the extravagance involved in manipulating people and in working a whole group of folks to really focus on him and love him and adore him, later when he looks back at that, he sees the waste and extravagance in it, perhaps the meaninglessness of it. And that's going to be a key thing with Dick Diver, is a search for significance, or perhaps you might say a loss of significance. Part of Dick Diver's journey, and we'll get into this in book 2, or part 2, is Dick Diver was originally a psychiatrist, right? He was a great student of Freud and of these great Jung as well. And so he's a student of great psychiatrists, psychologists. He was a great philosopher in many ways as well. And so he had this great career set out for himself, a great career established, but he gives it up to go with Nicole. He gives up his own dreams and aspirations of being a great psychiatrist to basically just inheriting Nicole's money and hanging out on the beach. And so where is this? Where is the outlet for what he knows about the human mind and people? Well, basically this becomes his side hobby of manipulation. And yet at the same time, a man who was made, as it says in the text, we'll read later on, a man who was made to do great things in the world of psychiatry is now reduced to a beach bum, a socialite. And he sees himself in this role, and this self-analysis draws him into a melancholy, the narrator tells us. Draws him into a melancholy that just recognizes the meaningless and extravagance of his life. And that's pretty interesting. So, what does Fitzgerald's... Oh, I didn't finish this part. But to be included in Dick Diver's world, he goes on, for a while was a remarkable experience. He was good at this, right? People believed he made special reservations about them, recognizing the proud uniqueness of their destinies buried under the compromises of how many years. He won everyone quickly with an exquisite consideration and a politeness that moved so fast and intuitively that it could be examined only in its effect. Then, without caution, lest the first bloom of the relation wither, he opened the gate to his amusing world. So long as they subscribed to it completely, their happiness was his preoccupation. But at the first flicker of doubt as to its all-inclusiveness, he evaporated before their eyes, leaving little communicable memory of what he had said or done. This guy is compared to a Wizard of Oz in a sense, all smoke and mirrors, creating devices to draw people in, to make them really feel that he cares. Yet underneath all this, in the tone, at least in the narrator as he describes this, is that it's all smoke and mirrors. This guy doesn't care. People believed he made special reservations about them. There was not a deep care and love for people necessarily. That's not what the narrator seems to say. It was all a game for him, a mental, psychological game. At At 8:30 that evening, he came out to meet his first guests. His coat carried rather ceremoniously, rather promisingly, in his hand, like a toreador's cape. Interesting connection to bullfighting, right? So he's all about the showmanship. It was characteristic that after greeting Rosemary and her mother, he waited for them to speak first, as if to allow them the reassurance of their own voices in new surroundings. Almost patronizing, right, in his ability to read and interpret people's needs. Dangerous in his ability to manipulate. And to manipulate without them even knowing he's doing such a thing. And so I wrote here in my notes, what does Fitzgerald seek to create in Dick Diver? What does Fitzgerald seek to create in Dick Diver? I think another question to ask here is, where else can we find Dick Diver in literature? What other literary influences do we see this type of character? Or where do we see Fitzgerald draw Dick Diver from in literary history or in other works of literature before? A major magician, if you will. We see this with Prospero in a very magical way in Shakespeare's The Tempest. A man who knows how to manipulate a scenario to benefit himself. Now, Prospero seems to have, now I could be, people could argue this too, but Prospero seems to have people's best interest in mind. Dick Diver has Dick Diver's best interest in mind, or at least that's what the narrator seems to communicate. But he is a master magician of sorts over people's minds. So what does Fitzgerald seek to create in this character? What type of man is Fitzgerald trying to set up for us? Is there an archetype that he fits within? We see strength and power. We see control over others. We see a certain magnetic charm. We see extravagance for the sake of control and power. We see mystery and intrigue. This definitely bears some Byronic elements, does it not? In many ways, it seems like a Byronic hero. And we'll kind of see, in some ways, what Fitzgerald does with that very interesting connection between Dick Diver and the Byronic hero. I'm not going to really go into what the Byronic hero is in this. I want to Google that. If you don't know what a Byronic hero is, if you look up characteristics of a Byronic hero, that'll come up on your Google search. And just kind of skim through that and then make some cool connections. So, yeah, I might want to push pause and do that and then come back, because that will be a really interesting thing to kind of think through as you consider Dick Diver. In this text, Fitzgerald uses a film technique called montage. On page 30, we see an example of this. And as I mentioned before, Fitzgerald had a career in Hollywood. We mentioned $1,000 a week. He had a career in Hollywood, screenwriting, and really started screenwriting early on in his career. And so he was working with the film industry, and so part of that, the techniques of how to make a film, carries over into his writing of a text or writing of a novel. On page 30, we see this. Rosemary stood beside Tommy Barbin. He was in a particularly scornful mood, and there seemed to be some special stimulus working upon him. He was leaving in the morning. Going home? Home? I have no home. I'm going to war. This guy Tommy Barbin is pretty cool. What war? What war? Any war. I haven't seen a paper lately, but I suppose there's a war. There always is. Don't you care what you fight for? Not at all. So long as I'm well treated. When I'm in a rut, I come to see the divers, because then I know that in a few weeks I'll want to go to war. Rosemary stiffened. This is a conversation between Rosemary and Tommy Barbin, which is a funny connection, right? Tommy Barbin is all militancy. Rosemary is all fluff and light and little actress girl. Rosemary stiffened. You like the divers, she reminded him. Of course, especially her. But they make me want to go to war. Rosemary considered this to no avail. The divers made her want to stay near them forever. So, what is this thing called montage? We have the idea of superimposition versus sequence. Again, a film technique that involves the laying of images over other images, dissolving from one scene into another, each element perceived on top of the next, not next to. And so here, where do you see the superimposition of images, the laying of images over other images? Well, the idea of war is connecting or overlapping. Tommy Barbin's relationship with the divers is overlapped here with Rosemary's. Right? Rosemary is infatuated. She's a young girl. What's the word? A starlet. She's a young starlet, a young actress. She's very interested in the divers. She's all taken up in their scene and what they represent in society. She really wants this. Tommy Barbin, he kind of symbolizes the brutality of war and the brutal reality of life and conquest and so forth. And so how are these? They're superimposed. We have Rosemary and we have Tommy Barbin. And as we look at these things, Rosemary's kind of peeled away and Tommy Barbin sits right in front of us as this man who, when he's around the divers just long enough, he wants to go to war. He wants to be engaged in some act of violence because he needs to purge himself. Perhaps, I would read into it here, Tommy Barbin wants to go to war to purge himself from the unreality that is represented in the extravagance of the divers. And the only thing that will purge him from all this fluff and light and just manipulation is just real brutal conflict. Because with the divers, you never get face-to-face conflict. With Nicole and Dick Diver, you only get manipulation. You only get hit sideways or from behind, or in cockeyed situations you get manipulated and twisted around. And so perhaps being around Dick too much, Dick Diver, who is this puppeteer, this master of manipulation, is perhaps being around him too long is what Tommy Barbin says. I just got to go to war. I want to punch someone in the face. I want to kill. I want to be brutal. I want to manhandle. I want to get my hands involved in bloody conflict, because all I get with the divers is this tinkering, this manipulation of my mind, and it makes me want to get directly physical. That's one way of looking at that. On page 34, the diver couple. There's an interesting section here. The interesting point of view is employed at the beginning of this text. On 34, we see Rosemary as dewy with belief as a child from one of Mrs. Burnett's vicious tracts, had a conviction of homecoming, of a return from the derisive and salacious improvisations of the frontier. There were fireflies riding in the dark air and a dog baying on some low and faraway ledge of the cliff. The table seemed to have risen a little toward the sky like a mechanical dancing platform, giving the people around it a sense of being alone with each other in the dark universe, nourished by its only food, warmed by its only light. And, as if a curious, hushed laugh from Mrs. McKisco were a signal that such a detachment from the world had been attained, the two divers began suddenly to warm and glow and expand, as if to make up to their guests, already so subtly assured of their importance, so flattered with politeness, for anything they might still miss from that country well left behind. Just for a moment, they seemed to speak to everyone at the table, singly and together, assuring them of their friendliness, their affection, and for a moment the faces turned up toward them were like the faces of poor children at a Christmas tree. Then abruptly the table broke up. The moment when the guests had been daringly lifted above conviviality into the rarer atmosphere of sentiment was over before it could be irreverently breathed, before they had half realized it was there. So there's a different perspective kind of taken on here, a more naive perspective, but again, from the perspective of the people that are involved. And again, we see this montage, I suppose you could say, of perspectives. And in a certain part, you're taking the perspective of the people at the table who really feel like the divers, they really like me, and they're really involved in our lives. They're looking at us. Boy, this party, there's so many people, but they're looking right at us. That's the sense. And yet from the diver's side, we have this idea of manipulating, of trying to rise up and then escaping just at the right time, right before they would be discovered, perhaps, right before reality might set in. They go stage right or stage left. So both the naive perspective of the people that the divers are manipulating and the diver's perspective of at a point of manipulation, of trying to keep control. We have a youthful, honoring, mesmerized perspective, and then one that is caught up in the reckless extravagance. So, let's think about these characters here. So we have Dick Diver as master manipulator. We have Nicole. Not a whole lot is said about Nicole so far. We learn more about her journey later on. Rosemary, a young starlet on her way up in the acting world, in movies, and she's known for great movies. We have Tommy, who is really more of a mercenary, right? He doesn't, what war? Any war, doesn't matter, I'll fight any war you want. So he's a mercenary character, one who's a hired military man. We have the McKiskos, who seem to be nothing more than just socialites that are caught up in the swirl that the divers create. So they're kind of the epitome of those who the divers have a control over, again, as marionettes, handling puppets. So Rosemary's journey is an interesting one. We see that on page 47. Again, I'm working with this text here. It looks like this. On page 47. She found Campion downstairs in the deserted lobby. "I saw you go upstairs," he said excitedly. "Is he all right? When is the duel going to be?" I don't know. She resented his speaking of it as a circus, with McKisko as the tragic clown. "Will you go with me?" he demanded, with the air of having seats. "I've hired the hotel car." "I don't want to go." "Why not? I imagine it'll take years off my life, but I wouldn't miss it for the worlds. We could watch it from quite far away. Why don't you get Mr. Dumfrey to go with you?" His monocle fell out, with no whiskers to hide in. He drew himself up. "I never want to see him again." "Well, I'm afraid I can't go. Mother wouldn't like it." As Rosemary entered her room, Mrs. Spears stirred sleepily and called to her. "Where have you been?" "I just couldn't sleep." "You go back to sleep, Mother." "Come in my room." Hearing her sit up in bed, Rosemary went in and told her what had happened. "Why don't you go and see it?" Mrs. Spears suggested. "You needn't go up close, and you might be able to help afterwards." Rosemary did not like the picture of herself looking on as she demurred, but Mrs. Spears' consciousness was still clogged with sleep, and she was reminded of night calls to death and calamity when she was the wife of a doctor. "I like you to go places and do things on your own initiative without me. You did much harder things for Rainey's publicity stunts." Still, Rosemary did not see why she should go, but she obeyed the sure, clear voice that had sent her into the stage entrance of the Odeon in Paris when she was 12, and greeted her when she came out again. Now, so we have a few things going on here. So we have the duel, and what are the people's response to the duel? "Let's get seats up close. Let's see this thing. Somebody's going to get shot. It's going to be awesome." Again, building into our theme of extravagance and recklessness. Life is something that should be just embraced and gone after in wild excitement. What's the next exciting thing we see again here? And Rosemary, interesting, as kind of a newcomer to this scene, doesn't quite know what to do. She feels like it's wrong, and something in her tells her it's wrong. And yet she's convinced by her mother's guiding, because her mother has been really the key to her success. She's convinced by her mother. And so she, as our naive, kind of unassuming, captured character, in some ways she's the eye for the reader. She's the eye of the reader. She's one who we see things through in their extravagance, in their insanity. We see through the naive eyes of Rosemary. She is full of belief, hope, and vanity. And for her, this is in some ways a coming-of-age motif. What would it be like to be coming of age in the 1920s in this extravagance? What would you have to do? What was required of you? And here Rosemary is learning these new qualifications. She's learning these new things that she must fall in line to do to be accepted by this society. So we see these women in this text, and those are our key characters, right? Rosemary, Mrs. Spears becomes kind of an influential character here as well, and Nicole. Another character that will come on later is one named Baby. That's Nicole's older sister named Baby. The women of the novel are interesting, and I think one of the things that Fitzgerald writes here, on page 52, into the dark, smoky restaurant, smelling of the rich raw foods on the buffet, slid Nicole's sky-blue suit like a stray segment of the weather outside. Seeing from their eyes how beautiful she was, she thanked them with a smile of radiant appreciation. Interesting that's a comment there, that comment. Seeing from their eyes how beautiful she was, she could tell. Again, she, much like Dick Diver, can see from other people's perspectives. And so she sees in their eyes their admiration of her, and so she thanked them with a smile of radiant appreciation. They were all very nice people for a while, very courteous and all that. Then they grew tired of it, and they were funny and bitter, and finally they made a lot of plans. They laughed at things that they would not remember clearly afterward, laughed a lot, and the men drank 3 bottles of wine. The trio of women at the table were representative of the enormous flux of American life. Nicole was the granddaughter of a self-made American capitalist, and the granddaughter of a count of the House of Lippe, Weissenfeld. Sounds pretty important. Mary North was the daughter of a journeyman, paper hanger, and a descendant of President Tyler. Rosemary was from the middle class, catapulted by her mother onto the uncharted heights of Hollywood. Their point of resemblance to each other and their difference from so many American women lay in the fact that they were all happy to exist in a man's world. They preserved their individuality through men, but not by opposition to them. They would all 3 have made alternatively good courtesans, or good wives, not by the accident of birth, but through the greater accident of finding their man or not finding him. I like this point, the idea that they were happy to exist in a man's world. All 3 of these women are getting along, not trying to find their own independence, but really being comfortable with and happy with being in a man's world, playing by a man's rules. That's going to be something to think about. We're going to develop that as we go along here. Nicole, she seems to exert far more control than she admits in some ways. She doesn't admit it because that would be taking control on her own, right? So she's subversive in the way she exerts control, allowing men to appear to be in control, and in fact she is in control underneath. Rosemary also seeks control under the guise of innocence. Rosemary, same issue, right? Seeks control under the guise of innocence, allowing men to lead, or at least appear to lead, all the while manipulating from behind or from underneath. Well, the psychological conflict in the text is pervasive. We have internal deliberation, we have psychological tension, and you want to look for different points where this surfaces. I think a key point where the psychological conflict rises is on page 72. It goes like this. These were of 2 sorts. There were the Americans and the English, who had been dissipating all spring and summer, so that now everything they did had a purely nervous inspiration. They were very quiet and lethargic at certain hours, and then they exploded into sudden quarrels and breakdowns and seductions. The other class, who might be called the exploiters, was formed by the sponges, who were sober, serious people by comparison, with a purpose in life and no time for fooling. These kept their balance best in that environment, and what tone there was, beyond the apartment's novel organization of light values, came from them. The Frankenstein took down Dick and Rosemary at a gulp. It separated them immediately, and Rosemary suddenly discovered herself to be an insincere little person, living all the upper registers of her throat, and wishing the director would come. There was, however, such a wild beating of wings in the room that she did not feel her position was more incongruous than anyone else's. Interesting way to describe social climbing, or climbing of the social ladder, as a beating of wings. Have you ever been in that situation where you know people around you are clamoring for attention, adulation, congratulation, elevation? I'm trying to think of other shun words that work there. Have you been in a group like that where there is this sense of people really trying to become noticed, people trying to be appreciated? To connect that to a beating of wings. There was such a wild beating of wings in the room that she did not feel her position was more incongruous than anyone else's. This idea of beating of wings to describe the desire, again, for a rise in opinion, a rise in value, a rise in social value, a rise in class, and to be appreciated by other social classes or social classes. This is the game among classes and within class distinctions. How do we become appreciated within a certain class structure? We beat our wings. We show off in a very animalistic way. This is a very interesting way that Fitzgerald is describing culture as being quite animalistic, right, bestial, in its fight for recognition. There's nothing very logical about this, right? It's showing off. And really no one wants to be called a show-off. There's a certain cultural or socially acceptable way to show off. And perhaps it's by being, we might call a me monster. I don't know if you know, there's a great comedian called Brian Regan. His name is Brian Regan, R-E-G-A-N. Definitely something to hit on YouTube when you have some time and you're ready for a hilarious moment. Brian Regan, and then type in Brian Regan and me monster. It's fantastic. But anyway, I take this from Brian Regan. Brian Regan always is talking about, in this sketch he does, talks about people who are always trying to one-up you. Always got a better story, got a better thing to say, and just braggers. Want to always bat their wings like animals do in nature, as part of mating rituals, right? You see animals, we see rams butting up against each other. You see birds with wild, extravagant beating of wings. Fitzgerald is equating the 1920s persona, the 1920s social movement, as a massive beating of wings of what? Look at me in my extravagant dress. Look at me in my extravagant behavior. Look at me. Here's an exercise for you to do. Throw on the pause button here after I say this, and take 10 minutes to write. Support the following theme, as you've seen it develop so far in the text. Money is a corrupting force. Because this will be interesting if you do this now, as the text develops, and you've already read the text, I guess, but in this text, how would you describe money as a corrupting force? Hit pause right now and write for 10 minutes about money as a corrupting force in Fitzgerald's work. I'll take a little break.